My name's Cathy Elder. I was in my mid to late teens when Welsh Women's Aid would have come about in 1978. I'd heard about this magazine called Spare Rib, but I didn't know where you could buy it. And it was a very staunchly feminist magazine, and I did manage to find an alternative bookshop where I would go every time I'd saved up enough money to buy my precious copy of Spare Rib and read about what some amazing women around the world were getting up to in terms of equality. Things that we used to call the glass ceiling, which you don't hear talked about so much these days. And the glass ceiling was this kind of invisible line beyond which women weren't supposed to be able to be promoted in terms of business and career. But nobody would actually admit to the fact that women weren't being promoted because they were women. And I was thinking back about Louise Brown. That made me remember about contraception. And of course, the pill had been around for a while then. But again, it was something that you didn't talk about necessarily. And I also started thinking about the fact that feminism was seen as quite an aggressive thing and that women were always supposed to be running around burning their bras. I don't think I remember ever seeing a woman burning her bra. Perhaps somebody did once and it was caught by a journalist and it became an urban myth. Who knows? I think one of the things about feminism that has changed is it seems to have become a softer movement now. It's more of a gentle campaigning rather than protesting and marching along the motorways up to Westminster. Other things that have changed as well is that the idea of not having to give away your marital status by your title was picked up by me certainly and many others, so that rather than being Miss or Mrs, you could be Ms. And many men took a huge objection to this, whilst at the same time not understanding that they, as men, only had to give themselves as Mr. and therefore did not inadvertently disclose whether they were married or not, and didn't seem to understand that was a personal right to let other people know whether or not you were married. So that sort of attitude has softened, definitely. However, I think the misogyny aspect is still very prevalent. It's not so long ago that Tony Blair first got into Parliament, and at that time there was an incredible increase in the number of female MPs, which was absolutely fantastic. However, the media at the time decided to dub them Blair's babes, which was so undermining and made these strong, independent, forceful, active women seem like little dolly birds who were sort of pootling about in Tony Blair's wake, and a lot of us found that very insulting, that the media should choose to adopt that sort of attitude. Something else that's changed as well is in terms of things like domestic violence and abuse of power and so on, is that I do remember very distinctly that back in the 70s, if you heard of a woman and her family that had encountered that, they were called battered women, and that has now changed. You wouldn't hear that kind of terminology anymore. It has become slowly we are getting to a recognition that this is about power and control, and the terminology and the language around it is starting to change. And there are some fantastic things happening now where gender equality is starting to play out in terms of, rather than it being a battle of the sexes, is what we always used to talk about, it has become much more collaborative. And so you have amazing campaigns like the White Ribbon campaign, where men themselves are standing up and saying, if we're going to change things around abuse and violence, then we men ourselves have to start making those changes. So that's really, really encouraging. Life doesn't stand still and society doesn't stand still, and I think that's something that's interesting, reflecting back over 40 years of celebrating Welsh Women's Aid, is that's why it's as important today as it was 40 years ago, because society, communities, attitudes are constantly changing. And I think one of the great things about an organisation like Welsh Women's Aid is that it does keep its finger on the pulse. And that's what's so important, and it provides a lifeline of information, advice and support to so many people, which for me makes their role so important.